Welcome back, fellow druids. We got another full circle here. As always, I'm Chad, Shadow Caveman on all the stuff. So, today, and I actually kind of wanted to do this sooner, but today, in this episode, what I want to talk about is a new. It's not really a new concept, but I want to talk about a concept that was introduced regarding list building, and specifically list pairing, that was introduced to me at two separate times by two different Canadians, although I believe that one also was introduced from it for the other. So while I was at MuseCon, Matt McWatters talked about this concept with me a little bit, and then Tim Banky talked about it on the Fully Boosted podcast, which is one that I actually still try to catch when I'm able to. And this concept that we're going to talk about actually comes apparently, and I'm not going to try to explain what it means in that game, but apparently it comes from competitive Pokemon. And the concept of this is you have sweepers and pivots. And I'm not going to lie, I don't fully know enough about Pokemon. It's sort of explained that, but the basic gist is a sweeper is just something that is extremely powerful, and just has massive, sounds like massive power, massive output, etc., etc. And in that game, a pivot is something that you use, as I think as the name implies, to sort of change the direction that a game is going or match is going. And so they are often like defensive in nature or more flexible and not necessarily just based purely on power. And so I'm not going to belabor the point with Pokemon because frankly I don't know enough about it, and if I'm going to do that I may need to try to get like Tim or Matt to pop in the show and we'll talk about it more. But I do understand what they're talking about with it regarding War Machines. So how does this concept, how do we apply this concept? And the answer to that is what we do. We have sweepers and pivots in this game as well. And the gist of it is, I know a lot of people have been confused because sweeper sort of implies like infantry sweeping, because we sort of talk about that a lot, right? You're able to sweep up a lot of models, sort of sounds like that. That's not what we're talking about. So a sweeper is, in effect, a powerful list. To a degree, a lot of times when we talk about lists where we're like, this is a question list, it's something that asks a question, that a lot of those would generally, not always, generally be sweepers. But overall, it's a list that has objective power to it. And it's something that is generally difficult for an opponent to answer to overcome. So that's the sweeper side. And then the pivot side is a list that you sort of, we would know it today as like the list you drop when you can't drop your like main list, but really it's the list that you drop when your opponent can handle your sweeper. So now you need to pivot. You need a list that can take on, basically, gives you options, right? This is a list, as it's been explained to me, that as an example has a lot of versatility to it, is able to play into a broader amount of games, because basically you're looking at, if you can't play your sweeper, you need your pivot to fill that gap, and you may not even know what those gaps are, right? So the example, and I'm going to use a non-circle example to start this off because that's how I understood it. The example is from Matt McWatters, who I mentioned. He's playing, at least at MuseCon, he was playing Gatsby 3 with the 9 Slayers, and then he was playing Denegra 2, also in Black Industries, some character jacks and some other stuff. But one of the things, too, when we look is we say, like, why would you play 2 Black Industries lists, right? Like, that's going to affect your output, or it's going to give your opponent too many too much knowledge, etc., etc. But in this case, those lists are actually very different. And the Asphyxious 3 list very, very much is, I have 9 Slayers here, 3 Arc Nodes, and some stuff. If your list can't handle this, I'm dropping it. If I don't think you have the answer to this problem, I'm dropping this list. And what that does to, as it was described to me, is gives him a lot of power in the list selection process, right? He can identify immediately, can I drop this list from what he sees? And he knows if he can't, then he goes to Denagra 2. And Denagra 2 is chosen specifically because she is a caster that is something of a toolbox. She has many, many different ways that she can create scenarios in the game to win. She has the ability to clear infantry. She has a damage fixer. She has an accuracy fixer. She has a pretty reliable assassination threat. She has a little bit of a question of her own, right? Can you deal with incorporeal models or not? She has ways around terrain. She brings a lot of tools to the table, and as such, she's a really good list when Asphyxious, at least to his belief, when Asphyxious doesn't work, he can drop that list, and he should have the tools he needs from that list to solve the problem that he still has. So, and this has been really useful for me, because what it's helped me do is, so you can look at casters and sort of see if they would be sweepers or pivots a lot of times. You can also look at your list and see that, because as much as I think if you go back and listen to that podcast that I talked about, Banky talks about a lot of casters specifically being certain things. Some of that's going to be subjective. Those are his opinions, although this concept is more something he's thought of than I have, so I respect those opinions, at least at this time. But as with anything in the game, what I say is my opinion, what he says is his opinion. There may be some differs, right? So just bear that in mind. But additionally, the way you construct the list may change it, right? So if you know that you have very much your sweeper in mind, and you're going to pair something else with it, and you want to take a powerful caster, you may do that, but you may build a list with more flexibility rather than more raw power in one particular way. And the reason you don't want 2 sweeper lists is you're probably going to leave yourself, same with pivots. Pivots, you're going to find that you have, I think you're going to find the list chicken problem is going to get more difficult, and with sweepers you're going to find it will as well, but it's going to be more that you're going to have more gaps because you don't have a list that's flexible enough to give you a game in those situations. And some of what I have talked about regarding my particular Una 2 list is that I think the way that I had it built, or I have it built, is that it is very much a pivot, right? Where I have a lot of different answers. It can play into a broad amount of things, but it doesn't like crush. There are some things that the list did crush, but like it's not a list where you go like, here this is like, it had a bunch of tools in it that helped it to evolve. So like I would say an Una 2 list that would be a sweeper would be like some of the lists that you see out there with in Call of the Wild with 7, 8, 10 Griffins in there, or I would even say to a degree the 7 Griffins with the Storm Raptor version that I played way back, I would call that a sweeper, because now I'm relying on the power of that alpha and the output related to it, Hand of Fate, basically to just overwhelm my opponent, right? Whereas in this case, what I'm doing is I have a lot of output, but it's also, it's also got a lot of flexibility. Wolf Riders are by definition a flexible unit. I've got those solos, they're pretty flexible. I've got a smaller battle group, so my alpha into some things is not going to be super powerful, and so forth. So, and as a result, the Kruger list I'm playing, so that he talks about Kruger a bit and as being possible to be both, because he just frankly has so much power. You can build him to be a sweeper or a pivot, but the way the list that I play, and I'd say the list most people are playing with Kruger plays, I would personally call it more of a pivot. And that's because you could put more raw power into it with Wold Guardians, you could put more melee power, you could put more range power, But the Wold Wardens and Megalith very much are giving you just a lot of different options in a lot of different games. And Kruger the only thing he lacks is a damage fixer, but he makes up with that with just some insane control and scenario threat that he doesn't really need the damage fixer, so he's sort of like replacing that with those elements. As opposed to like Denegar 2, who was the previous example, where she's a toolbox, but not she has some scenario presence, but not to the extent that he does. So, and this works well, right? Because anything that I'm bringing with Kruger, I can, I'm going to be able to play that list into a lot of different things. So now if I have a really powerful list and I know like, oh, it's not powerful in this matchup, hopefully I should be able to fall back on Kruger too. And there's going to be lots of casters in Circle that are going to be pivots. And I would say many of them are going to be casters that you're going to be able to play into a broader number of things, but be closer to, but you might be closer to the situation where you need to use your list to outplay your opponent than just like I put my list down and my opponent had no chance. So some of those things. So in Bones, in the podcast I talked about this, you're going to look at guys like Mosar, Wormwood, Kruger 2. They're going to fall into that sort of bucket. In Bones, I would put Tanith in that boat. She's got a lot of different tools. She's not a survivable at range, but she does have a lot of different tools. Gets a little tricky after there. Baldur 1 could be in this category, certainly, depending on how he's built. I think... I'm trying to think, because I haven't been as like I haven't been in as heavy of list creation right now. But anyways, those are some casters that you could look at that are possibly going to be in that pivot mindset where they have different tools and it's how you utilize them and how you build the list, and they should be able to give you a game into a lot of different things. And just to be clear, this doesn't mean, I'm going to backpedal a little bit, but this doesn't mean that like there's nothing that's a bad pivot or a bad sweeper, right? Like just because something is objectively would be a sweeper doesn't mean that it's strong necessarily. So let me try to think of a good example. So before the Tharn CID happens, I would actually call, to a degree, I would call Kruger 1 in the Tharn theme a sweeper. I think we could debate that a little bit because I think he's also kind of a problem solver and he's in the middle. Well, let's not use him as an example. Let's talk... Circle doesn't have... I'm too positive about Circle to have a lot of good examples here. Well, I called Tanith a pivot, right? So just because she's a pivot doesn't mean that she's the best option to be a pivot, right? Doesn't mean necessarily that she's strong at doing so right now. The tools she brings are stronger and weaker in different environments, right? So the meta does still apply to this, right? Certain things are like her playstyle, because again, she also has a damage fixer, a map fixer. She can answer high armor in some ways. She's got a little bit of survivability, a little bit of movement, but like mostly she's a toolbox. But if the things that if the elements of her toolbox aren't as efficient right now, she's also still not going to be the right choice. So just because you understand that you have a sweeper and you have a pivot doesn't necessarily mean that what you have of those is strong. You still want to try to make the strongest list you can. However, as an example, not to say you couldn't do this, but like I would be a little hesitant necessarily playing Bradigus and Baldur 2 in Bones. And the reason for that being that I think lists that can deal with one may be able to actually deal with the other not too poorly. Counterpoint though, if you're playing Baldur 2 as your sweeper and Kruger 2 as your pivot, now Kruger plays a very, very different game, even with Wolds, as Baldur 2 does. So anyways, some examples of sweepers are some of our obvious stuff, but like I put Chromac 2 in that category. I might put Chromac 1 in that category. Kaya 2 probably. Kaya 3. Una 2 with Call the Wild list. And the theme is going to change this a lot. Like, a lot of Secret Masters lists, for example, right now I would not... I would see less often as a sweeper because they're going to, by definition, have more flexibility. A lot of Call the Wild lists I'm going to have a hard time seeing too often as your pivot, but that doesn't mean they can't be. So there's no hard and fast rules with this, and this is, I should probably, I may change the name of this before I post it. I just have it named Sweepers and Pivots as I'm recording. But I may change it a little bit because this is very early on in my understanding of how this works. I have not thoroughly explored this. I would say one of the pairings I'm testing, which is a popular pairing right now, and this sort of explains why, is Kruger 2 Bradigus. Bradigus is definitely a list with a lot of power in it, and if you look down and your opponent can't deal with Bradigus, well, you've got Kruger waiting right there to hopefully be able to win the game through control. And that's good. In the same way, if I were to go back to, and I'm not on the fence on what I'm doing here, but if I were going to keep playing my Una 2 with Wolf Riders, having Baldur 2 as my sweeper, which I talk about in a little bit in some other podcasts about how I did with it, but I think if I wanted to and could put in the time for him, he could be a proper sweeper to pair with that list. Or maybe my Una 2 list needs to change even a little bit more, like to the version I originally had that had the Death Wolves in it. Things of this nature. Or maybe it needs Ravagers, or there's many different approaches I can take. So that's sort of the idea with the different lists, right? You want to have, and that's going to help you in list selection, right? Because now you should kind of always know what you're going to do, right? Is my sweeper strong enough in, with the two lists they present, is there one of them that my sweeper can't deal with? And by can't, and like definitely can't deal with. And if so, now I need to look at my pivot list, which hopefully gives me a game into both lists. Nothing's going to be perfect, so I don't want to pretend that this means that this is going to solve all list chicken scenarios. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have the right tools for every job. And there's also things, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree with this, but I definitely believe it's true. Sometimes the sweeper list definitely depends on the environment. Morvana 1 plays an actually incredibly strong sweeper list if there isn't a prevalence of the things that she has to go to her pivot to play. And so, for example, that's something I'm likely to explore in Champions for the next season, which is actually starting soon enough that I think I could probably start testing that. She's just incredibly strong in those situations where if you have no answer to her recursion, even as it stands, if you're playing Devourer's Host and you're using Blood Trackers as your primary source of that, if you can't answer the recursion, she's going to have she's just going to always have a full unit of people on the of models on the table, and that's just how it's going to be. So, and you can sort of see looking at her kit, right, why she's a sweeper, right? Like, can you answer her powerful recursion? No. Well, then you're going to drop her. But if she there's a number of things that are popular right now that are answers to her. So that might make her, in Masters style, regular steamroll style tournaments, that may make her a bad choice. In Champions, there's a couple, right? I think one of the Scorn themes has RFP, and I think you can still play Blind Water, but those are the two. But I don't think Mayloc's in, so I don't know if you're going to see the quad posse. And without those, depending on what's played, I guess, with those, if you can go to your sweeper most of the time when you play into Scorn, and possibly into Blind Water, that leaves a lot of matchups where you may want to play Morvana 1, just as a hypothetical. So, and as a side note, I think her power level increases substantially if the options she has to bring with her increase as well. So there is that. So that's kind of the concept here. I think you're going to hear me use this discussion or talk about lists in this way going forward. I may start talking about more of like what I'm planning to pair. Like I said, right now I'm testing Kruger 2 and Bradigus. There's some chance of looking at Kaya 3, Chromac 2, Kaya 2. I've actually really debated. I may play that just to see. That'll be a venture down a non-themed direction, so maybe yeah, anyway, so that's the idea, but I don't want to necessarily dig too far into it. I really need these concepts to sink in a little bit more. I may actually talk, there's a few folks who really have gotten into this concept. I may talk about it. I would really love, I've talked a little bit in Discord and in the Facebook group about it, but we can certainly have some further conversations, or maybe even talk more deeply about like what casters and in what way, for that sort of thing. So anyways, as always, I appreciate all of you tuning in and listening to the show. I'm hoping I need to make some space on my table back here at some point and do, I know Shifting Stone Tactics episode has been requested. I don't know exactly when I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to try to do it very soon. As always, if there's any suggestions, feel free to throw them out there. Share us out on social media. Continue the conversations there. And I will see you for the next